All right, we're going to begin our semester by discussing two Greek myths, Apollo and Daphne and Persephone and Demeter. These two myths are part of a larger cultural trend during the Greek and Roman periods in which rape and abduction myths were very common. I can't say why exactly, but throughout their sacred literature and mythological stories, women were very frequently abducted and raped. Even goddesses, so even divine women, were not powerful enough to escape being raped or abducted. Oddly, in these stories, in many of these stories, the women come to love their rapists. So eventually, sometimes after the fact, they sort of consent in reverse or decide that they're not so unhappy about it after all, which again is a very disturbing but just realistic trend of what was going on during that period. I made you a list just so you could see how common this idea was. And this list is by no means complete. These are just the most famous ones I could think of. So once upon a time, Medusa was a very beautiful young woman, and she was raped by Poseidon, the sea god. So Poseidon took her to Athena's temple to rape her, and this made Athena mad at Medusa, not Poseidon for some reason. And so because she's so mad, Athena turns Medusa into this snake monster thing. So very strange idea of responsibility and blame there. Helen of Troy is, of course, abducted by Paris and or Theseus, depending on which translation you're reading, and that naturally causes the Trojan War. Cassandra is raped by Ajax. Leda is raped by Zeus, who turned himself into a swan. I'm not sure if you can picture such a thing happening, but that's what they believed. Antiope was raped by Zeus in regular human form. The Sabine women, which was a huge group of women, were raped by early Romans. Persephone, of course, as you read, raped by Hades and comes to love him, depending on your translation. Daphne Apollo attempts to rape Daphne, not successfully, but she also comes to consent. Lucretia is raped by Sextus Tarquinius. Philomel raped by Tereus, her brother-in-law, very creepy, and the list goes on. So very, very common trope in Greek and Roman myth. Specifically, the first one you read was Apollo and Daphne. So the backstory between Apollo and Daphne is that Apollo was one of the best with a bow, so he was a really, really good marksman, and he's bragging about being such a good marksman in front of Cupid, who he makes fun of. He says, "Cupid, what do you think you know about that bow and arrow? I'm the greatest archer there is." And so to kind of get back at Apollo for being so proud, Cupid shoots one of his golden arrows at Apollo, making him fall in love with Daphne, and he shoots one of his lead arrows at Daphne, making her hate Apollo, and not just Apollo, but seemingly all men. So Daphne has no interest whatsoever in a husband or sex or anything like that. So when Apollo does see Daphne, he, because of Cupid's curse, cannot resist her, and he begins chasing her. He calls out to her, "Silly girl, you do not know from whom you are fleeing. Indeed, you do not, or else you would not flee." So he's still very proud and says, "Honey, if you knew who I was, you would turn right around and run to me, right?" So in his mind, there's no way that a woman could possibly want to refuse him if she knew who he was. And then as he's chasing her, we have this kind of description of the chase, and I want you to notice the imagery here and how it relates to gender. So he's thinking, "Even so, when a Gallic hound spies a hare in some open meadow, he tries by his swiftness to secure his prey, while the hare by her swiftness seeks safety." So notice already that the predator, the dog, is illustrated as male, and the prey, the hare, is female. So we have a predator-prey model of sex, wherein the man is trying to, what? To conquer the woman? To eat her? I'm not sure. The dog, seemingly just about to fasten on his quarry, hopes at every moment that he has her and grazes her hindquarters with his outstretched muzzle, but the hare, uncertain whether she has not already been caught, snatches herself out of his very jaws and escapes the teeth which almost touch her. So there's a very violent depiction of sexual desire here You could imagine him trying to trap her in his jaws, the way that a dog would trap a rabbit. Ultimately, Apollo wins the chase. Daphne knows that she can't outrun him forever, and just as he's about to finally catch her, she cries out for help to her father and says, "If you rivers really have divine powers, work some transformation and destroy this beauty which makes me please all too well." So notice that in Daphne's mind, it's her fault that she is being pursued like this because she is so beautiful. So she is sort of responsible in her mind for Apollo's pursuit. And her answer to that is to stop being beautiful. And so the gods answer, and they turn her into a tree. I've included for you here on the right the famous sculpture by Bernini of the Rape of Daphne. And Bernini was famous for sculpting a story at the climactic moment, so the moment of the highest action. And so you can see here, this is literally when Apollo finally gets his hand on Daphne's body, and already if you look at her fingers and her toes and her hair, they're beginning to turn into leaves at that very instant. Now, of course, not even turning into a tree helps Daphne escape Apollo's advances, and so he still says, "I love you even though you're a tree, and I want to wear crowns made out of your branches," and so on and so forth. And at the end, we learn that the laurel tree inclined her new-made branches and seemed to nod her leafy top as if it were a head in consent. So somehow, for some reason, after Daphne has been forced to turn herself into a tree to avoid having sex with Apollo, she consents to his love. Very strange. Next, we have the story of Persephone, Demeter, and Hades. Once again, I included for you the very famous Bernini sculpture of this moment called The Rape of Persephone. And again, it's done in the height of action. So this is the very moment that Hades has snatched Persephone from Earth. If you look very closely, you can see that his fingers dig into the flesh of her body. So she is very much resisting him, and he is very much closing in on her. You can also see in the lower corner down there his three-headed hellhound Cerberus that he's very famous for. The Persephone, Demeter, and Hades myth is famous for lots of reasons, and one of those is because of the female archetypes. An archetype is like a type of character or a type of story that is common across all time and all culture. So no matter where you go in the world or where you go in history, we have these same types of characters and stories. So the three female archetypal characters are the maiden or virgin. So that's going to be like Persephone at the beginning of the story. The mother, who is very nurturing and caring for all, and that's going to be like Demeter, the goddess of the earth and harvest and fertility. And then we have the idea of the crone. So the crone is sort of like an old, aged woman who is unbeautiful and almost unlovable and often has magical power. So if you think about all the old wicked witches in fairy tales. And Persephone essentially becomes the crone once she marries Hades and becomes queen of the underworld. So she's like the queen of the dead. And so the story is famous for kind of making that circular archetypal figure. So Persephone begins as a virgin and leaves her mother, becomes the crone, but then every year returns back to her mother as a daughter again, and so on and so forth. This myth is very much connected to the Greeks' idea of nature. So they saw nature as inherently female and feminine. Think about Daphne turning into a tree. So Demeter was the goddess of the harvest, of making things grow. All the flowers and trees and plants and things depended on Demeter. And once upon a time, everything was perfect. Demeter was happy all the time, and everything grew constantly. And then when her daughter is kidnapped, Demeter grieves and everything dies, which is why ultimately the other gods force Hades to return Persephone for at least half of the year, every year. And this is why the Greeks believed they have 2 seasons of pleasant weather, spring and summer, where things grow, and then 2 seasons of unpleasant weather, fall and winter, where everything dies, because those are the seasons in which Demeter is grieving. Again, we have some very complicated issues of desire and consent depending on which version of this myth that you read. In all versions, Persephone is definitely kidnapped and raped. She does not willingly go with Hades. She does not want to leave, and she's a very young girl. And then again, in many translations, when Hades returns Persephone, she can't wait to get away from him, and he kind of sneaks those pomegranate seeds into her mouth without telling her the consequence of them. So he kind of tricks her into coming back. But in some other versions, she actually comes to love Hades. This is sort of like the version that you read. She comes to love Hades, and she becomes queen of the underworld, and she likes it. She likes the power. She's a very good queen, popular with the people of the underworld, and she doesn't really want to go home. So again, kind of a troubling idea of one coming to love one's rapist. Historically, it's all kind of a little fuzzy in terms of when these myths were not only written down, but just kind of spread throughout the culture. But we believe that somewhere between the 10th century BC and the 8th century BC, these stories were committed to the culture, which is the same time that lots of the early books of the Old Testament were written. And there is a lot of crossover between many stories in Greek mythology and stories in what we would consider the Hebrew myth. And one of those connections is between the story of Persephone, Demeter, and Hades, and the story of Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So you might notice some of those similarities. There is a woman tempted by the devil. So in this case, it's Persephone tempted by Hades. In the Bible, it's Eve tempted by the serpent, who we've associated with Satan, although it doesn't necessarily spell that right out. And in both cases, the devil is tempting the woman with a piece of fruit. And that fruit, in both cases, allows her some kind of forbidden knowledge. In the case of Persephone, it forces her to become the queen of the underworld and to always be linked to the underworld. And in Eden, eating the fruit expels Eve from God's sight in Eden and forces her to live on earth. So some interesting kind of correlations there. I wanted to finish by giving you just a couple of other illustrations of these myths that I thought were really kind of entertaining. On the left, you have a Renaissance painting of Apollo and Daphne, and you can see that they're kind of in Renaissance clothes. And this is a much more literal illustration, I guess, of the transformation. So Daphne's arms have literally become bushy tree branches. So I thought this one was kind of funny. And then on the right, I've always loved this illustration. We have Persephone and Hades coming up to meet Demeter on the day of the exchange. So you can see Demeter up top in the left looks very much the mother goddess. She's very voluptuous, and she's kind of a big woman, and she's excited to see her daughter. And in this version, Persephone is also very excited to see her mother, so it's almost like she can't wait to escape the underworld. If you notice down just above the rock line, you can see flowers beginning to bloom, so Demeter's joy is beginning to blossom. And I always thought this was kind of a lovely illustration. And if you see Hades' face, he does not look very pleased about this exchange, but a deal's a deal, so he has to abide by the arrangements. I hope you enjoyed these myths, and if you have any questions as to how these myths relate to our larger discussion of women's studies, please feel free to send me an email.